Madison Community Foundation helps donors support the community and the causes you care about most. With philanthropic expertise and personalized guidance, Madison Community Foundation makes it easy to achieve charitable giving goals. Whether you choose a specific field of interest, open a donor-advised fund, or create a legacy that will last for generations, Madison Community Foundation is here to help every step of the way. Make your gift today. Learn more at madisongives.org/giving. Root to Rise gives Dane County High School students a chance to find direction and confidence. Each day in the classroom, Root to Rise tutors work with young children, building the kind of trusting connection kids naturally respond to. As one student shared, Root to Rise changed my life. When I started, I didn't care about school and didn't think I'd graduate, but working with younger kids changed everything. I got more confident and wanted to do better. Support Root to Rise today at roottorise.org. That's root, the number 2, rise.org. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Today, state lawmakers are currently looking at how the Department of Public Instruction handles educators accused of misconduct against students. The renewed interest was sparked by a multi-part investigation published by the Cap Times. Joining me now is the investigative reporter on the beat, Danielle Duclos. Danielle, welcome back to CityCast Madison.
Thanks for having me, Bianca.
Yeah, so I have to say, before we get started, this conversation will cover sexual misconduct and grooming toward children. So if you're out there listening and it's not the time or place to listen to this subject matter, now's a good time to pause this episode and come back. And if the topic is too sensitive altogether, that's totally understandable. Feel free to go find a past episode you might have missed or come back tomorrow. But with that warning, we are going to dive in. Danielle, I know you've been working so hard on this reporting for more than a year. What originally sparked the interest in uncovering what is happening at the Department of Public Instruction, DPI, when educators are accused of sexual misconduct?
Yeah, so this journey started for me actually before I even got to the Cap Times, when I was an education reporter in Green Bay and had covered just a single case in a school district up there. And it really kind of opened my eyes to this world where people didn't know a lot about it in terms of the public. And there were a lot of questions I had about what's happening, what are school districts doing, how does it work at the state level? And like the key question for me that I wanted to try to answer is, how often is this happening, right? And that wasn't really being tracked by anyone in the state of Wisconsin in a comprehensive, systematic way. And so the Cap Times set out to answer that question when I joined. And so for the last about year, I've been investigating not only how the Department of Public Instruction handles these cases in terms of educator licensure, but also how are school districts keeping records on this and what are school district policies and things like that.
Was that a surprise to you when you were like, wait, they're not tracking that at all?
Knowing what I know now, I wish to say it was a surprise, but that's something like that tons of the researchers and advocates I spoke with, that's like a key sticking point, is that even the federal government hasn't for years been tracking this in any systemic way. And so the data and the lack of data has always been a big problem with addressing this topic, because as one of the researchers I spoke with, if you don't know how often something's happening, how do you address a problem, right? Do you need tons of resources? Or you have enough resources? What needs to happen in order to get to a solution? And so that, while I think surprising to a lot of people and surprising maybe to me on the onset of this, isn't surprising knowing what I know now.
Yeah. And so just to that question, how common is the experience of sexual misconduct by an educator toward a student? What did you find?
Yeah, so one of the most well-cited studies on this is actually from 2004, so it's quite old at this point, but it is kind of the widely accepted statistic. It's about 1 in 10 students during K through 12 education will experience some form of this sexual misconduct at the hands of an educator or school staff member. And that comes from a literature review commissioned by the U.S. Department of Education, authored by Dr. Cheryl Shakeshaft, and she has been researching educator sexual misconduct, prevalence, and prevention for decades.
And so what do we know about like how widespread of an issue this is in Wisconsin specifically, like in terms of DPI and, how many educators they investigate and, what other details came out from your reporting?
Yeah, so the Cap Times reviewed over 400 educator misconduct license investigations conducted by the Department of Public Instruction from 2018 through 2023 and found that over 200 of those educators were investigated for allegations of sexual misconduct or grooming towards students. And that is a likely undercount, right? So those are only the instances that reach the Department of Public Instruction. And so the researchers and advocates I spoke with who study and advocate for prevention of educator sexual misconduct said that that's definitely just the tip of the iceberg. So those are like the best numbers that we have right now, but the actual prevalence is still unknown.
So over 40% are known, and it's expected to be more than that.
Yes. And so for about a fifth of the cases that we looked at through the Department of Public Instruction's like internal sheet tracking this, we weren't able to like code or categorize the conduct that was under investigation. So there's still an unknown within that number as well. So that's why in the reporting we said at least, I think it was 46% of the cases that we reviewed had to do with sexual misconduct or grooming.
Wow. So how does DPI handle reports of sexual misconduct? Do they have the capacity to handle all of these investigations? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's been interesting hearing, I talked to them for this story and hearing also what they've said since it's published. And so they have one full-time investigator and one part-time investigator who are reviewing and doing the investigations for these misconduct cases.
For the entire state?
For the entire state. And this is not just sexual misconduct. This is any type of like misconduct complaint against an educator with a license that would come to DPI. And so they also have other job duties, I was told by the department spokesperson. And so they, I think, would like to see more resources in this area. They've said that they want more funding and have blamed lawmakers for cutting DPI's operational budget and have cited that they want more resources to be able to do this work.
I'm trying to think about, like one full-time investigator, hundreds of investigations, like what's the depths that they can go on? Because that's really some of the scrutiny here is you're like, they're not really tracking this. Like there are holes in this process. And I'm curious about the process around investigating teachers. Like what happens when they're investigating a teacher? Like what are they looking into? What happens to teachers that DPI is investigating?
So when DPI gets a complaint, and there's multiple ways that DPI can receive a complaint. So the average community member can file a complaint with DPI, parents and educators, anyone can just file a complaint. And then there is a statutory requirement if an educator resigns or is fired because of any suspicion that they engaged in the statutory definition of immoral conduct, the school district is required to let DPI know that, and then DPI investigates what was going on. And so from there, if and when DPI decides to open an investigation, they go about gathering evidence, trying to conduct interviews, get documents, et cetera, things like that. And then they basically bring it to the investigators will put things together into a report and then bring it to the license review team, and they'll talk through it and make a decision about how they're going to proceed, whether they're going to revoke the license, whether there isn't enough evidence, whether the person agrees to voluntarily surrender their license. And it kind of goes through that process there. But as DPI said, like every case is different. And so it just depends on how much information they have access to and kind of the circumstances around the complaint.
You spoke to several experts and survivors for the story. Several is maybe an understatement, many experts. And once a teacher or educator has crossed that line, like what are the consequences for the educator that's crossed the line? And then, is anything done for the students that have been harmed? Like what happens next?
Right. And I think going back to what we were talking about earlier is underreporting, right? And so a lot of times, like students don't know that this is something they should be reporting. Specifically with boundary crossings and the grooming process, the point is to gain the trust of the child and to manipulate them into accepting whatever behaviors are happening. And so a lot of times there's like delayed disclosure when it comes to children who have experienced sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and grooming behaviors and things like that. And depending on the severity of the conduct, some of this conduct is criminal, particularly if it's sexual abuse of children. And so law enforcement are hopefully getting involved in investigating on that front. Educators can lose their license to teach or have their principal license or their substitute teaching license or whatever the type of license they have. They can lose that if they're found to have been engaged in immoral conduct, which is the state's statutory definition of basically behaviors that are contrary to the well-being, health, and safety of students.
And can you share a couple of examples of that, actually? Because there's people might think it's, a sexual assault, but there are lots of things before that, including, texting. And there's a fair amount of behaviors towards the kids that fall under that umbrella.
Yeah. So there are a lot of behaviors before they escalate to outright sexual abuse or sexual assault that are also concerning. And a lot of the researchers I spoke with, they call these boundary crossings or the grooming process. And so that can be talking about sexual topics with a child, which is completely inappropriate and never okay in any situation. And it can be also just frequently texting students on social media about educational topics as well. And a lot of the boundary crossings take a traditional student teacher relationship and turn it into a peer-to-peer relationship where students see the teacher as a friend or, someone other than an authority figure in school. And so it can be also desensitization to different types of touch, whether that's touching someone's knee or their lower back. And the intent behind those can be hard to suss out in the investigation process. But regardless, I think what researchers have told me is there needs to be clear expectations about behavior so that the intent doesn't really matter at all. You shouldn't be touching students or you shouldn't be communicating with students on their personal social media, things like that, to make it very clear about behavior expectations between students and teachers.
And escalating intimacy, basically, and that's part of what makes it so pervasive and challenging is changing the expectations of what the relationship can look like. You'd cited an educator who is giving students rides home and things that are starting to blur the boundaries. Yeah, we're friends. This is something that I can expect that you'll be in more parts of my life than just school and as an educator.
Yeah, and boundaries are really important to maintain, all the advocates and researchers I spoke with. And having other people intervene, bystander intervention, is a huge part of this prevention process, right? And if you think about that, with bullying, right? Bullying education, if you see something, say something. And that's true for preventing educator sexual misconduct as well. And that's everybody in a community, right? If you're seeing something in your school, like a teacher consistently meeting one-on-one with the student in a behind closed doors all the time, maybe check in on what's going on there, make a report, do an investigation, and it can be substantiated or unsubstantiated, but at least there was an investigation, there was a report made, and there was documentation of the outcome. And that's something that's really important in the prevention space, as well as having training to understand what are our collective behavior expectations in a school setting, and making sure everybody's aware of those. And when they see those expectations not being followed, a report is made or someone intervenes in that interaction.
Madison Community Foundation works side by side with donors who want to make a positive difference in the place you call home. For more than 80 years, Madison Community Foundation has supported local nonprofits, schools, parks, trails, and cultural spaces, helping ensure Dane County remains vibrant, welcoming, and full of opportunity. With personalized philanthropic guidance, Madison Community Foundation helps donors support the causes that matter most to you. You can focus on issues and causes you care deeply about, establish a donor-advised fund for flexible giving, or create a legacy that continues for generations. Every gift, big or small, strengthens our shared future, and Madison Community Foundation is here to help all donors achieve their charitable goals. Make your gift today. Learn more at madisongives.org/giving. Four Seasons Theater presents The Hello Girls, a new American musical. It's an uplifting new musical inspired by history that chronicles the story of America's first women soldiers. These intrepid heroines served as bilingual telephone operators on the front lines. They helped turn the tide of World War I and pave the way for future generations of women in the armed forces. Ready to feel empowered? The Hello Girls runs December 11th through the 21st. That's Thursdays and Fridays at 7:30 p.m., Saturdays and Sundays at 2 p.m. at the Playhouse at Overture Center. Plus, there are pre-show lectures, Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. and Sundays at 1 p.m. in the Playhouse lobby. This is a remount production from spring of 2024, y'all, that played to sold-out audiences, so you know it's good. Learn more at fourseasonstheater.com. Tickets are available starting at $25 through the Overture Center box office in person, by phone at 608-258-4141, and at overture.org. Something has already come from your reporting. An outcome from your initial story is that State Rep Amanda Nedwesky, a Republican from Pleasant Prairie, is drafting legislation in part to close the loophole in which teachers can voluntarily give up their teaching license to avoid a full investigation. That's a major part of your coverage here that we need to unpack a little bit. Nedwesky later called for an informal hearing with DPI in October, and I want to hear about what happened in that hearing. But before we get to that, what is this element of teachers basically getting a chance to subvert scrutiny and an investigation just by stepping away? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so this is quite common even at the school district level, like resigning in the middle of an investigation or resigning to avoid being terminated. And at the licensure level, at the onset of every misconduct investigation, regardless of what the accusations are, DPI offers the educator the opportunity to give up their teaching license forever, and they will close the investigation immediately. And some of the researchers I spoke with, the concern that they raised there is that then there's no official finding, right? So did this happen or did it not? And then while DPI does report when that happens to this national database, where if that teacher went to a different state to try to get a license, they would see that they had surrendered their license in Wisconsin. That database is only available to those other state agencies, like state education departments. And so it's not available to the public. And so a concern is when you don't have documentation or transparency about why someone's surrendering their license, they could still go work with kids in other capacities, right? You only need a teaching license to have a teaching position or an instructional position in a school. You can still do private tutoring. You can still go do the rec soccer league and be a coach there. And so having access to this information and more transparency around the circumstances around why someone lost their license is important for that accountability and just understanding of what happened.
Oh my God, who is that supporting? What is that rule supporting? Do you have any sense of where that came from? That seems like it's not supportive of students or kids.
DPI, after the article came out, did argue that that is a way to prevent victims from having to go through an investigation process if they're not interested in doing that. And so it can be a way to get a teacher out of the classroom and out of, instructing in schools or interacting with children in schools through a licensed position without having to do kind of the laborious investigation that can be traumatizing.
I totally hear that, re-traumatizing for the victims. But how realistic would it be that the victim would say, actually, can he just give up his license? I could see some critics thinking that it's less work for DPI to not have to go through that investigation. So here's a faster way out. But hey, I mean, that's why this is getting hearings and why, legislators want to have this process reviewed and get under some scrutiny, because that seems like a valid concern that if somebody doesn't have it on their record why they lost their license, that they could then, further victimize, students. So let's go back to that outcome where State Representative Amanda Nedwesky is working on this legislation. They called for an informal hearing in October. What did DPI reps tell lawmakers in that hearing?
Yeah, so there's been 3 legislative hearings about this topic since the article published. And so that was the first one that happened. And Dr. Jill Underly, who's the state superintendent, did not come to testify at that particular hearing, but she had some other folks from the department come and speak. And one of the things that they talked about was really needing more authority in their investigatory power. DPI currently doesn't have subpoena power, so they can't demand that documents and information be handed over to them. And, they've talked about, when I was talking to them, having access to like unredacted records or unredacted police reports and having access to all that information. And so DPI seems to want more authority to be able to go deeper into these investigations. They also talked about wanting to broaden the definition of immoral conduct, which is the statutory requirement to revoke a license, to specify grooming. But there seems to have been some pushback from Republicans on that committee. It's the GOAT committee, the Government Oversight and Accountability Transparency Committee, I believe is the right term.
It was like our version of Doge.
Mm-hmm. And so the Republicans on that committee seem to push back a little bit on whether adding a grooming definition to that statute would be helpful. But they also heard from law enforcement at that informational hearing, and they said that criminalizing grooming would help law enforcement do their job. And so DPI has since come out and said that they also support the idea of criminalizing grooming, which would in turn, they think, get more reports to them to be able to investigate. But it's yet to be seen whether they're going to be updating the immoral conduct statute to include a grooming definition. And the members of that committee did ask the Attorney General for an opinion on whether the current statute encompasses grooming behaviors or it should be updated.
Wow, it just sounds like there's so many holes in this process. It's almost 2026. And now it's like, okay, there actually needs to be an infrastructure for this, and this matters. Like, this is, the hearing DPI say that we need more authority if they can't get the documents and they're the investigators. It just seems like there's a lot of work to be done to have a more effective system. Like, you're really shining a light.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a lot of gaps in the system. And I think one of the key impacts of this reporting is that people are talking about it. People are now having conversations about, well, what do we need in terms of resources? What are the gaps in the system right now? And I think that's really important because, as many of the researchers I spoke with said, this topic thrives in secrecy, right? Educator sexual misconduct and grooming, like that depends on the fact that people aren't going to talk about it for it to continue to exist. And so having public, transparent, and honest communication, throughout the community, throughout the state is really important for identifying, okay, where are the holes law enforcement are experiencing? What are the holes DPI is experiencing? Where do school districts need support? Do they need more training? Do they need more, funding? Like, what is it that needs to happen so that we can move towards a solution? Because every child should feel safe at school and have a safe experience at school.
Yeah, and you said that the state's head educator, Dr. Jill Underly, was absent from the first public hearing. There have been 2 more hearings since that she attended. What have you heard from Underly about your reporting and these 2 later hearings?
Yeah, so Dr. Underly did attend 2 other hearings, and those were informational hearings. So lawmakers were asking a lot of questions about what DPI needs. And again, she reiterated a lot of the points that were made in the first hearing that she didn't attend about, needing subpoena power and wanting a grooming definition somewhere in law. But she also underscored, the department does great work. Was their stance is that they do investigate, that they, work really hard and are doing a really good job. And that's been her perspective in response to my reporting's findings.
Root to Rise helps Dane County high school students, especially those who haven't yet found joy in their education, get on a stronger path by supporting young children in elementary classrooms across Dane County. Each day, they sit beside kids during reading and math, answering questions, offering encouragement, and building the kind of trusting connection children naturally respond to. Teachers notice it right away. They call these teens, quote, extra hands, extra voices, and extra leaders, and say classrooms feel more productive with them there. And for many students, this becomes a turning point. As one shared, Root to Rise changed my life. When I started, I didn't care about school and didn't think I'd graduate. But working with younger kids changed everything. I got more confident and I wanted to do better for them and for myself. If you believe in giving young people a strong path forward, please consider making a Giving Tuesday gift at roottorise.org. That's root, the number 2, rise.org. Of course, our governor, Tony Evers, is a man who staked his career on education. And as far as I understand, he's been largely quiet on this issue recently in terms of, this recent uproar that's happened from your reporting. But you've also uncovered that Evers made an attempt back when he was the head of DPI to update the teacher misconduct guidance. So this is not a new issue. And it turns out his proposal never made it to law. So what did this 2017-2018 attempt look like and why did it fail? And is it relevant now?
Yeah, it's been really interesting doing kind of a historical look. So these issues are not new to DPI, and my reporting uncovered them in a new way, I think. But so back when Tony Evers was state superintendent, the administrative code that basically oversees the operations of license investigations was getting an overhaul. So he was basically revamping that administrative code to include some of the things that my reporting identified, such as requiring the final disciplinary order for educators who lost their licenses to be publicly posted online, as well as expanding the different types of discipline that DPI has access to. So right now, they really only have the option of an educator voluntarily surrendering their license, or they can revoke it. There is no in between of like, we're going to issue a formal reprimand or we're going to suspend your license for a certain period of time. And so those were some things that Tony Evers was looking to do while he was state superintendent. However, during the rulemaking process, written in government documents, the agency said because of negative pushback about these changes from stakeholders, they decided to take out those portions of the rule changes, and it never ended up becoming part of the administrative rules that are now active.
Wow, so it sounds like that's a through line is pushback.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting to see that written in a report from the agency saying that there was clear disagreement about how to proceed with the licensure investigation changes. And so they were going to scrap those and maybe go through a different rulemaking process for that. But then, of course, Tony Evers was elected governor and was no longer a part of the Department of Public Instruction.
Yeah, so we've been talking about government oversight. Let's turn to talk about the school district's responsibility here. Your latest piece of coverage really takes a deep dive into an East High School teacher who was arrested in 2020 for secretly filming students for years while chaperoning field trips. Some of those students filed a lawsuit against the teacher and the school district. Why did they say MMSD was at fault?
Yeah, so they argued in their lawsuit that MMSD basically gave too much authority and did not give enough oversight to this educator. And so that allowed him to be able to secretly film students and engage in other behaviors. And so he ultimately pled guilty to federal charges, including attempting to make child sexual abuse material. And so in the lawsuit, the students really were arguing that because of MMSD's policies and their lack of oversight of this educator, he was able to do these things. And ultimately, the federal judge presiding over the case, dismissed MMSD as a defendant, saying that the students didn't show directly how this educator's behavior was connected to actions of the district. But the students I spoke with, 3 of the students, former students who were participated in the lawsuit, still maintain that the district didn't do enough to protect them from this educator's grooming behaviors and other boundary crossings that escalated to him filming them.
Hmm. What are the experts that you talk to telling you about what can be done at the district level to prevent situations like this?
Yes. So what's great is there's a lot of researchers out there who have really gone deep into this issue and have outlined step-by-step types of policies that school districts could adopt. And specificity is a big part of it. And so while you can't have a policy for everything, having specificity in your policies to explain behavior expectations of educators is really important. So, for example, a policy recommendation by some of the researchers I spoke with is to not have educators communicating with students on personal electronic accounts, right?
I was shocked that that was happening. I must be so disconnected, but I'm thinking, why are teachers texting kids? Am I that disconnected?
That's like a policy, right, to prohibit that and require it to happen on like a school district email, or there's something called Remind, which is like a text platform that the account can be owned by the school district and overseen in that way. And like MMSD, for example, they have guidelines that say we recommend that you use district accounts and district devices to communicate with students. And we recommend that you do not follow students on your personal social media. But it's not a policy. So if that were to be violated by an educator, it's not enforceable as like there are going to be consequences. And another key part of the prevention is having enforceable policies that are then actually enforced, right? And so if there is a violation of a policy, such as you have to meet with students with multiple people in the room, right? Like you can't meet one-on-one with a student behind closed doors or whatever the policy might be. If they see that happen, then it's written up or there are consequences for that. And then also a key element of prevention is training, right? So you can have fabulous policies, right, that are really specific and have things really well laid out. But if no one knows about those policies, it's really hard for them to be implemented with any efficacy, right? So if no staff are fully trained on the policy, if students are not aware of the policy either, so that's a really key component as well, is like students need to be trained on this too, and obviously in age appropriate ways. But in the cases of like, you shouldn't be friends with students on social media, if students don't know that, then how are they to report or know to report when the substitute teacher or the music teacher friends them on social media and starts messaging them, right? And kids, right, they want to be liked by their teachers and they're excited to have attention and they want to engage with people they admire. And teachers are usually people that children look up to. And so that's kind of where that power dynamic comes into play and the grooming process can start to develop. And so it's really important for training to be there as well, so that everybody in the school ecosystem is aware of those expectations on behavior and relationships and can report violations.
I remember as a student, there were creepy teachers. There were teachers that people kind of, and students are like, oh, this guy's kind of creepy. You know, it's like, how, you know, teachers hopefully notice that, like reporting systems that don't let the kids have to be the report, that something has to happen.
Right. And I'm sorry to hear that. It's something that everyone I've been talking with, even just casually about this story, they all have stories like that, whether it's a teacher that they had or a bus driver or it was their ice skating coach or whatever it was. You know, so many people have stories of that. And that's very true in a lot of these cases. And in the cases I reviewed in Wisconsin and just, you know, the literature, there's red flags. There are usually always red flags. And it's unfortunate too, because some people will also look back and other people in the community or in the school and say, oh, that makes sense that person did that or whatever. And sometimes it's not super surprising. Sometimes it is really surprising, but there usually are red flags and having people understand what those are. And I think too, it's like the bystander intervention part that we were talking about and having people, if they see, you know, like a staff member's leaving the building, it's the end of the day, they see a teacher and a student, maybe they're getting tutoring help or whatever it is, pop your head into that classroom and say, hey, you know, all tutoring has to happen in the library during these scheduled hours. Like, let's all walk together to the library, right? And those types of things where it doesn't need to be this like surveillance state that maybe people think all these specific policies would be creating, but just a culture of accountability and like looking out for each other and helping other people stay accountable too, because a lot of teachers are very well intended, right? And don't have this nefarious purpose. You know, this is a very small subset of educators and they can have very broad impact on a lot of students. Like the MMSD case with David Crutchin had 137 identified victims of just one person. So they can have a broad impact
Right.
and it's just one person. But I think it comes down to just having people understand the policies and it doesn't need to be a whole to-do. A lot of the researchers I talked to were like, it's not that hard. It's just a dedicated effort to do it.
there's lots of things in the middle, like lots of interventions that can happen that it's just like, oh, this is going to be night and day, total change. It's like, but there's nothing in the middle, or there are some things, but they're falling totally flat, like very inadequate. And there are all of these holes. So it is, people have trouble with change. I do want to take a second to acknowledge the bravery of the young woman who spoke to you for your reporting. What did they say the impact was of the violation and the lawsuit that followed?
Yeah, those women are very brave and very admirable. Yeah, I mean, as one of the students said, it's the last quote in the article. She said, "I'm never going to be the same because of this." I mean, they were teenagers when they were going on these school field trips, and an educator who they greatly trusted, and he was involved in many of their activities, was also their teacher, did something that was it was criminal and unacceptable, right? He was filming them in their hotel bathrooms and sleeping areas, places where they should have had privacy. And I think for them, when I was speaking with them, it was more so like they feel like they got closure on the educator through the criminal case and going through that process. But I think for them, a key sticking point is they really wanted to see MMSD overhaul their policies and really just like trainings and here are all the things that we're going to do. And MMSD did change some of their policies. They updated some of their field trip procedures, and they have implemented new sexual harassment policies to be in accordance with federal regulation changes. But I think the students really wanted to see kind of this overhaul. And my reporting shows and an analysis of their policies that there are still gaps and shortcomings with their current policies, particularly around training for students on, if teachers are getting education about appropriate student-teacher boundaries, students should also be getting that on what the current policies are. And for example, like the East High teacher had students babysitting for him. And MMSD currently doesn't have any policies on babysitting, like students babysitting for teachers, whether they need to disclose that or file it with the district or there's a complete prohibition. There's just no policy on it at all. And that's one of the key things that can be present in the grooming process and is one of the key policies that researchers I've spoken with have identified as a way to prevent educator sexual misconduct.
Breaking those boundaries. Well, Danielle, before I let you go, obviously your reporting has done so much already, had a huge impact. Legislation is being drafted. There have been public hearings. Like there's a real spotlight being shown on the, gaps and what needs to happen for kids to be safe at schools. What now? What do you hope comes from this series of reporting that you've put out?
I never know what to expect when I publish a story. I never know if 2 people are going to read it or tens of thousands of people are going to read it, and it becomes a huge discussion in the state. And really, the whole point of this was to shine a light on this topic that is often undercovered and not discussed. And I really hope people continue to talk about it. And since the reporting published, so many people have reached out saying this happened to me, or this happened to my kid, or this is currently happening in my district. And I think the more conversations we can have about it, the more transparency, the better, right? And that's a key part of journalism, right? Is bringing transparency to issues that are undercovered and underdiscussed. And so I'm hopeful to see kind of where things progress in the legislative vein. The Joint Audit Committee also ordered an audit of the Department of Public Instruction on their practices for investigations. So I'm interested to see what comes out of that audit and to see what they find and if there are any recommendations that the Legislative Audit Bureau has for DPI. Right now, we're kind of in a wait and see part of the reporting, and I'm looking forward to continuing to cover this topic.
Well, Danielle, thank you for your reporting, and your commitment is so clear. I know how much work you put into this, and it's for such a good cause, and you're such a good journalist, and we just really appreciate you taking the time to also be in depth with us and cover your story and give us a picture of what's going on. I really genuinely deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Bianca.
That's Danielle Declos, investigative reporter for the Cap Times. To read her stories from this investigative project, head to our show notes for a link. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm your host, Bianca Martin. Don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. And if you found today's show valuable, why not share this episode with someone who cares about children? Alrighty, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care and thanks for listening.